Zach Meerbach here at the ZMF shop, and we're checking out, I want to check out the three Cayin amps. We got the 300B here, we got the HA6A here, which is the KT88 amp, and then we've got the HA3A. So all three of these amps have a standard output that can be controlled. You can only listen to one of these at once. Standard output 4.4, and then the XLR, and that's adjusted which one you're listening to by this little button right here. And then they all also have a low, medium, and high impedance. And you know, it doesn't give the exact output impedance on these. I might have to ask them, but I do know they suggest like 0 to 65 on the low, 65 to 200 or 300 on the medium, and like above 300 or 300 and above ohms on the high. Also, there's no steadfast rules. Whatever sounds best, I always say use these. You don't have to use the high with high impedance headphones or the low with low. You can do the opposite. They all also have these VU meters, which you can kind of see here. Interesting thing on the 6A, on the silver finish, it has that gold backdrop, whereas on the black finish ones it has the white backdrop on both of these. So I'm not sure if the silver Cayin has the gold backdrop or not. That might be something to look at. And then they all have XLR and RCA inputs, which is kind of cool. But they all take the 22 DE4 rectifiers. Interesting rectifier choice by Cayin. Not a common one, but one that's not too expensive to replace if you can find them. But you know, I haven't replaced them yet. If I do some tube rolling journeys on these, I will let you guys know. So far I've just done the driver tubes and input tubes on all of these. And yeah, that is all the similarities on the amps, and they all are transformer based tube amps, which is important to know too, which just more or less means that you have those impedance options that are adjustable by changing the taps from the transformers, which also means they play dynamic headphones well and headphones that are planar magnetic. You know, the kind of benefit of a OTL amp is somewhat that by passing that transformer, you get a little bit different of a timbre to the sound. The mids can be kind of have a slightly different openness to them, while the bass isn't always as fine or tight, but that is totally different on, you know, OTL amps. That's a generality that's not always true. So don't, you know, take that as any kind of you know, finite thing on those. Okay, the first thing to consider when you're considering these three amps is that the tubes that they take, especially the driver tubes, all kind of vary in price. So, you know, say, you know, the 300B is the most expensive amp, while the 6V6 is the least expensive, and that also goes for the driver tubes. You know, a 300B set is going to run you at least $200 for the cheapest one, and for the most expensive, thousands of dollars. I actually haven't listened to the most expensive 300B tubes because I'm kind of scared to shell out that money, but someday I will give one of those a try. KT88 or EL34 tubes, I've got 6550s in here that I bought a number of years ago, which are the same as kind of a KT77 or 88 type tube. And so those vary in price but are cheaper than the 300Bs. And then the 6V6 tubes are the least expensive to swap out. And so just remember to, you know, part of having a tube amp is wanting to swap the tubes out. Factor that into the price when you're looking at these amps, because it definitely is something to think about. Now, the next thing is the input tubes on these, and 6SN7s on the 300B, 12AU7s on both the 6A and the 3A. I don't have a preference innately for either of these. You know, the 6 SN7s, again, are more expensive to swap out. The expensive ones of those, especially of the vintage kind, can cost you a few $100s. Same thing with the 12 AU7s, but there's more vintage options available for a lesser price. I really like to swap in these Baldwins because they're really high quality. They were in those old organs, the Baldwin organs. And so that's a good option for swapping those out in the 12 AU7s. You know, for 6 SN7, I really like those 1953 Bad Boy Sylvania tubes with the 3 hole plates. I've got a couple sets of those, which I can talk about in a tube swapping video at some point. So just a reminder to factor in the tube prices, especially with them going up so much lately with inflation and everything that's going on with world issues. And yeah, so let's talk about differences between the amps a little bit. The only main difference as far as functionality is concerned is in the 6A amp that we're looking at here, actually. And so that mainly comes from this switch right here, where you can see it says on the left TR, which is for triode mode, and then UL, which goes to ultra linear mode. Aside from the you know, logistics and wiring and all of what that means, this is pretty rare on an amp. And just in layman's terms, you know, maybe I'll provide a link to talk about kind of the technicalities of ultra linear versus triode, so that someone who understands it really well can explain it to you in writing. Triode generally has a little more of a euphonic sound, a little more lushness, a little more bloom, whereas ultra linear is a little faster, maybe a little more solid state sounding. You know, transient attack is a little more, and honestly, that's one thing for headphone listening that makes the 6A maybe a little more versatile than the other 2 amps. And being the middle child, I mean, it's kind of like the Otor in our lineup. The HA6A kind of gets forgotten a bit between these 2 amps, I think, and when people are thinking about which one they're gonna buy. But that really kind of sets it apart. And the people who have demoed all of, you know, the HA or the 300B next to the 6A, you know, I would say it's 50-50 on which one they're gonna like more usually. You know, the 6A and 300B, both are about the same as far as how noisy the tubes are, how much chance there is for noise, but they both have enough power to drive just about any headphone. And it really comes down to, you know, functionality and which type of tube type you like more, whereas the 300B amp does have more power, more girth, more weight to the sound, and the 6A is a little more nimble. But I would say as far as tube swapping, if you want to get one of these amps and go to town on tube swapping the most, those KT88 tubes in the back and EL34 are going to be the easiest swap. And there's actually a switch in the back where you can, let's go back and look at that, you can change between what type of tube is going to be in the amp. So you can see you can change between EL34 or KT88. You just put the switch up or down. And so there's a couple of features on the 6A amp that make it really adaptable. The other thing, as we're in the back here actually with the 300B, is that you can run the 300B to speakers. I haven't done that yet, but you know, that's the thing about the 300B tubes. Tons of power. It'll get you that output to go to speakers, so you can listen to those and, you know, go between listening to speakers and headphones at the same time. It is recommended though that you don't have speakers and headphones plugged in at the same time. You don't want to tap the transformer twice that way. So just a reminder that, you know, unplug your speakers or your headphones when you're listening to those. Sometimes I know people want to leave them both plugged in at the same time. So it's always good to have, you know, one of them plugged in or not plugged in, because, you know, it is tapping the same transformer, even with the switch going both ways. If you're playing music through, even if it's on headphone mode, you might hear the speakers playing just a little bit at the same time. All right, as far as other sound quality impressions are concerned, I just love that Cayin makes 3 amps that have 3 distinct kind of sonic attributes. If I had to like kind of outline the differences between these three amps. Going, you know, from the smallest to the biggest, it is in a way like kind of the most nimble, clean, compact and tight sound, you know, as far as just like the way a 6v6 tube sounds. And you kind of go up to the 300B, you know, past the 6A to like the most girthy, thick, weighty sound. And all this can change with tube swaps. There's different types of tubes with all of them, but in stock form, you know, the 300B has the thickest, punchiest, weightiest sound, whereas the 6A kind of sits in the middle. I don't think any of them is better than the other, but I do think if you're looking for something that's the most unique, the 300B sound, there isn't another amp that sounds quite like a 300B tube. And the power output of the 300B too, you know, I know a lot of people like their Susvaras, their planar magnetic headphones. This is the one that's gonna run those hard to drive headphones with the most authority and give you the most unique experience with them. If you have, you know, the ability to swap out these 300B tubes, you're gonna be able to get tons of different sounds just because the construction of the modern 300B tubes, I mean, anything from L-Rog to Sophia Electric to the, you know, the stock tubes that come with these, you know, all the way to the new Western Electrics. I mean, there's just a ton of different sounds in those. And then as far as the 6SN7s, you can adapt like 7N7 tubes to those. I think the ECC33s or something like that. There's 6F8C tubes. There's just tons of tubes you can adapt to from the vintage tube sets. So there's so much adaptability there as far as the 300B amp is concerned. So as far as, you know, tube versatility, this one sits very high, just like the 6A, but the price of changing those tubes out is going to be really great. The other thing, the 300B amp also weighs like a ton. As far as this amp is concerned, sound-wise, it's versatile without tube swaps in the largest way because of this triode and ultralinear switch. And, you know, I would suggest, you know, to build into your budget a pair of KT88 tubes. I probably do slightly prefer the amp with the KT88 tubes. The JJ KT88s are pretty good. And, you know, the new KT88s, out of any of the new stock tubes of these, I think probably sound the best. It has like a really clean, punchy sound. So as far as stock tubes are concerned, it's probably close between the 300B and the 6A as far as these amps with stock tubes sounding the best. You know, I'd probably slightly give it to the 300B as far as stock tubes sounding the best, and then the 6A, and then the 3A. But, you know, building in a tube swap on the 6A is probably good. And as far as the 3, I think you definitely want to build in that tube swap and get some vintage tubes with that. This one, it lacks a little bit of body when you have the stock tubes in, but as soon as you go to something like, you know, these old fivers or some other kind of tube, it's good. It just opens right up, and it's just a beautiful sound. Yeah, so can't think of too much else to say about these 3 amps. They're all just fantastic listening experiences. I can definitely recommend each of them. You can't go wrong with any of them, and that's the thing. I wouldn't necessarily say the experience of owning any one of these 3 Cayin amps is head over heels better than the others. It's just there's differences. It all depends on what you want to get out of the amp.